But first off, as you can see, I've started off with a white undercoat. Next, you've got two main parts for these. You've got the armoured areas and you've then got the joint areas. So I'm going to go over the joint areas first in white. I'll get those parts done and then I'll show you so you can see the areas I've covered in white. So the first coat doesn't make it look that much different. It's just getting it ready for when we start putting the flaskets yellow on. And for the C-tan, I've used the Corax white instead of white scar, so it's slightly lighter, but it's not as bright as what we're using on these. So I'll apply the flaskets yellow on this and then I'll show you what that looks like. For the C-tan, I've started with putting in the shading first with the Fenrician grey. Easy enough, all you're doing is putting in the areas in the crevices. The only thing I've done which is slightly different really is I've added a few extra streaks just beyond the cheek here, and I've added a little bit of extra colour into the neck. Next, I'm going to use white scar to pick out some of the uppermost areas. I'll do that and I'll show you how it looks next. Now the white's finished, a couple of things I would point out. For example, on the stomach, on this side I've painted the lines on the top and the lines going down, where on this side I've only painted lines on the top. And you can see the muscles of the ribs. Mostly I've just followed the contours of the body. I've added a few extra lines. For example, I've added a short line on the bottom here. There's one on the shoulder to catch where light would hit from the top. There's another one here on the top of the head, as you can see there. And now it's painted, I'm actually using an old blue wash. However, with the newer paints, just get a blue glaze. And I've got 2 parts salami medium to 1 part the glaze or the wash. And I'm going to cover the whole thing. I don't need to paint these orbs. They're going to be slightly different. My intent is that the orbs will be a lighter blue as opposed to the blue of the C-tan himself, because unless I'm mistaken, I think the C-tan is in effect what generates the power for the device, and as that power gets drained out of him, I would imagine it would fade somewhat. So by making him darker than the rest, it kind of emphasises that the energy is fading as it travels further away from him. You can see that these, where I've added these extra lines, like the white on the top of the head there, it's a bit on the subtle side, but those little details just add a little bit extra into it. While the C-tan himself is drying, I'm going to start applying Corvus Black to this part here. And I want to try and avoid the orbs if I can. After the Corvus Black was applied, we've used a Scaven Blight Dinge, and I've used it to cover this facing here on both sides, and I've covered it on the inside but I haven't covered the outside area. I've done that on both of these. Next we're using white Scar to cover all 6 of these orbs, and we want to apply a couple of coats so we get a pure colour of the white Scar. I've mixed 2 parts Lamia medium with 1 part Loffen blue, and we're going to use this to cover the orbs themselves, but also to cover the inside of these areas and this front plate as well. This helps to give it a bit of a glowing effect coming from the orb area. You'll also notice the colour I've used for the orbs, I've also painted it a little bit into these lightning areas, for want of a better word, just to help blend in the light blue with the darker blue. Once the first wash around these areas was applied, a second wash was applied to help with the glow. Only where the first wash covered the whole of the surface, the second wash just covered this inner edge. Also, the same paint was applied for this little area here. Next, with Mechanica Standard Grey, just want to add a little bit of a highlight to the edges. The next coat is done with Uriel Yellow, and covering things like the top of these circular areas, for example, and feet. It's a bit hard to see on this stage. But the coat afterwards is Seraphim Sepia, and I find that the Seraphim Sepia works better over the Uriel colour than it does the previous yellow, the Flaskitch yellow. So I'll cover these areas, and then you can be easy for you to see where it's been applied and hasn't. But like I said, it works best if you use that particular yellow first before using this one. This paint is somewhat more noticeable, so it's easier for you to see. Once the first coat's dry, apply maybe a couple more coats. Places like on these arms here, the darker yellow is applied all the way around the lower half, leaving the Flaskitch yellow on the top half, and then the sepia, I'm just painting a line across. I'm not trying to cover the very bottom as well, just a line on this side, and then you would put a line on the opposite side. And once it's dry, like I said, another 1, maybe 2 coats just to give it, just to thicken up the paint. The next colour we're going to use is Agrax Earthshade, and some of these thicker areas we can apply some to give a bit more depth, and then also we want to start making some of these smaller areas stand out. One last area I've used this paint for would be the area where I've put it on the arms, so the very top of this line here. One last area I use this colour for is the top of these lines here on the arms, to give a shade of darkness to them. Phalanx Yellow to pick out some of the edges. For example, on the hips, I've got the top of the hip and the sides of the hips where we've got these circular areas, I've only used on the bottom half of the circle. And where I put these dark areas in before on the arms, I've now put a light line with the phalanx yellow across the side there. Next with dawn yellow, we're not going to go across that line again, but what we're going to do is put a line in across the top of the arm, and the top of the hip is just a simple line. We don't want to get too over the top. The circular areas, we'll now use this to cover the top of the circle. And we want to pick out a few more areas. Lastly, with this paint, you've got a couple of vertebrae here, and you've also got some on the back of the neck. So I've used this paint on the upper line here for the vertebrae. I've done the same on the back, only on the back I've also put lines going down on these vertebrae here. Here in the vertebrae, we've now applied Agrax Earthshade, and the reason why we're using a darker colour as opposed to using something like sepia is because it helps to create a contrast between the darkness and the light colour you've applied earlier. Corvus Black has been applied to the armour. The Scav and Bite Light Dinzo is only going to be used in a small amount of areas, just to pick out areas where light would hit the armour. So we've just covered the front of the legs going down the top part of the chest, so a little bit on the face, a bit on the top of these, and down the sides of these, this here, and halfway down on the black of this. Next we're going to use the Mechanica Standard Grey, and this is just to catch out the edges. For areas like the ends of the crown, here on the stomach and this piece, I started off by painting it Corax white. Next, with Fenrisian grey, I painted in the darker areas that you can see, and also I painted the very edge for these pieces on the crown. And these orb areas I've painted with Flashkits yellow. Next, with some Lamia medium and Lothern blue, I'm going to cover these areas for the crown and the stomach and this piece here. For the orbs, and I'm using it straight out the pot, I'm going to paint the Silent King's cloak as a separate video, and I'm also going to show how to paint these weapons on a separate video as well. So this is the end of this video. I hope you like it, and I hope you consider subscribing.